Okay. Well, first, thanks for the invitation. I think this is a great series. I was looking at the previous events that you guys hosted. It's always interesting to try to see global issues from different regional perspectives and how they impact regional perspectives, and regional issues from a global perspective. So the idea of creating a two-way conversation is always interesting. So thanks for the invitation. So based on the topic that that you guys asked me to address, and first responding to Monroe's questions, I certainly hope that the conversation is evolving and it's going somewhere. And I think there's a little bit of evidence as to how that has been evolving over time. So transparency reports are getting a little bit more complex, a little bit longer. The communications with companies are also getting a little bit better. What I'll focus today on are 3 points that I think are still pretty problematic in dealing with the information that we have from companies. So from a multiplicity of points of view, but particularly from transparency. The first is, when we're talking about automation, hate speech, AI, content moderation, I think there's a main issue that is pretty hard to address, and a lot of times we lose focus of it. It's very hard to diagnose what's happening within the companies. We have no disaggregated information on content moderation per region, per country. We do have this bucket, overall broad categories of content that they claim to identify and moderate. Some of it in an automated fashion, some of it in a more human-led fashion. But the bottom line is we're still looking at buckets, and within those buckets, we are unable to grasp the depth of the problem as a global problem. We're unable to identify what the nuances that the problem has in different parts of the world, in different contexts, in different situations. I'm sure the hate speech phenomenon must have been different during the Black Lives Matter, for example, protest in the US than it was during the summer, where political conversation was kind of quiet. Same thing can be said in pretty much every other country, and I think we're still missing the big picture. We're basing our diagnostics on a lot of anecdotal evidence that is piling up, but besides it being piling up, it's still anecdotal evidence. We have no systematic, systematized information about what the companies are seeing and how the phenomenon is seen from the other side of the screen. The second issue where I think there's an important problem is in the appeals process and the lack of clarity about how that works, particularly during COVID, where most companies announced that they were sending their human moderators home, and they started to inform their numbers based almost exclusively on automated moderation. I think there's a disproportionate lack of clarity as to how they handle appeals. And if you look at transparency reports, I don't think those clarify anything either. It's not clear how they consider the categories of appealed content, how they classify content. What is a piece of content? it's not clear what they mean by intervened content, which is the terms that at least most of the big companies use when dealing with appeals. At some point in time, there was a project out there, or an idea out there, to prioritize the appeals process in a couple of different companies. I wrote a small blog post about this. And the idea made a lot of sense, since the human moderators were a lot less than in normal times. Some companies were thinking about, okay, so we can open up a number of offices with a limited number of people. What should we do with the limited number of resources that we can actually put towards this task? How do we prioritize the content for human review? And although it was an interesting conversation to start, I haven't seen any follow-up to that conversation, and I think it's still pretty opaque how that prioritization is being done, if it is being done at all. The third point, and with this I will finish my intervention and look forward to the questions, is what are the companies doing? One of the questions that particularly came up in content moderation, particularly with the events of January 6th, but also more recently in May, with protests in Colombia and the Palestine protest, and the protest of Indigenous women in the US and Canada around May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. One of the questions that came up in discussing this with organizations like Carisma in Colombia and others that are dealing with this phenomenon is, what are companies doing? How are companies anticipating the application of rules that seem neutral on their face, but when applied to social conflict situations can derive in pretty problematic results, a pervasive sense of censorship from private companies, based on the application a lot of times of rules that were already there, but when applied in this specific context of social crisis, they tend to have very different results than those that they were created for. And I think there are serious issues of transparency and transparency on how they deal with the situation after the fact, transparency on how they prepare or how they proactively look at this situation as the situations are evolving, and transparency as to what happened in the meantime, in between the time that you realized that something was going on and the time that you fixed the problem. So I think there's 3 points there that I think are particularly relevant. A fourth point that I think could be interesting for these kinds of conversations is transparency around HRIAs, human rights impact assessments. And we've done a couple of papers on this. Yeah?
Say that again, I missed the key word.
Yeah, human rights impact assessments. We've done a couple of papers about this to understand a little bit better what companies were understanding by human rights impact assessments and what kinds of information are they willing to share with users and publicly. And what we found is that those processes are very opaque as well, and they should be having some sort of centrality, particularly when we're discussing algorithms and the impact of the algorithms that some of these companies deploy in using their services, and particularly for content moderation purposes. So those are my 4 introductory points, and I look forward to the Q&A.
That's great. Agustina, can I ask you personally, how do you split your time thinking about this? Do you go from crisis to crisis? That is, say there's the Palestine crisis, the Colombia crisis, etc. Is there a task force of people like you who try to focus on one after another? Do you focus on Argentina?
Yeah, well,
do you gain insight from your familiarity with what's going on in Argentina and then spread from there? So if you could say a word or two about that, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. So I direct the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, which I should have started with. And the center is a regional center. We work with consultants around the entire region. And what we try to do is work on global issues from a regional perspective. So no, I don't go crisis after crisis. There's a lot of civil society organizations that are doing excellent work in the different parts, in the different countries that I mentioned. We are a research center. We're based in a university. So we're sort of trying to provide tools and input and insight to ongoing debates about self-regulation, legislation, best practices, worst practices. But we definitely don't go from crisis to crisis. I think there's people on the ground that are doing an excellent job, or trying to do an excellent job in dealing with their own crisis. But it is important to look at those crises and be able to analyze them at a distance as well, to see the patterns, to see how they fit into the overall ecosystem.
Can I ask you a question, Augustina? And I'm delighted to see that Julie has joined us. Thank you, Julie. Welcome. Augustina, just a question, because at our last session, it was very interesting when we were talking with colleagues that were joining us from the Sahel region, and previously the earlier session, as I mentioned, we had colleagues from the Horn of Africa. And one of the issues that kept coming up was the difficulty algorithms have dealing with low resource languages, or African languages in particular. And so, for instance, our colleagues from the Sahel region were speaking about the ways in which it seems as though algorithms have improved when it comes to detecting hate speech or other forms of speech in French, but not so much in indigenous African languages. And I'm just wondering, how do you see these algorithms performing when it comes to addressing speech in Spanish? Because obviously Spanish is a lot more of a popular language, or it's more, presumably algorithms have been better trained on Spanish than they have on Somali, for example.
My guess is that they're doing better than in other languages that you're mentioning. But the truth is there's a lot of companies for which we don't really have any information on how that's doing. So it's hard to assess. We have a project that's called Letra Chica, which in English is fine print. And we are tracking terms of service and community guidelines and how those are changing. And one thing that should not surprise anybody is that most of those change every day, literally, like a comma or in some way they change every day. But most of the changes are in English. So that tells you a little bit about the or at least to me, it gives me an idea of the relationship, how changes in English relate to every other change in every other language when you have like 20 changes to have in a week. And I think the same thing is happening with algorithms, but it's intuitively, I don't have the hard data. Hi, Julie.
Julie, do you want to take your turn of 15 minutes and then we'll come back and combine these discussions?
Yes, good. I mean, I was about to say good morning, but it's not good morning for everyone. Apologies for that. There seem to have been some miscommunication. I wasn't supposed to speak at 6 a.m. Pacific time, but I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Yes, I will. I have a little presentation to share, so that allow me to. Oh, I'm not able to share my screen as a participant. So
no, you are. I just changed the settings. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let me now find the window with the. Okay, fantastic. So you should be able to see my screen now. So I'm going to talk about the Oversight Board, the Facebook Oversight Board, which was created a year ago to make decisions on content moderation decisions by Facebook and Instagram. These decisions are binding. So it means that Facebook has to reinstate a content if we say that they have to do so, or on the contrary, they have to take down a content if we think they have to do so. Why is that? It's because the board receives appeals from users whose content has been taken down, or from users whose content, who think content that is still available on the platform should not be there and should be taken down. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also receive appeals, or rather referrals, from the company itself, from Facebook, when it finds difficult to apply its own community standards. It was the case very recently when we received quite a famous case, which was that of former US President Donald Trump, and particularly his account suspensions on Facebook and Instagram. So a lot has been said about the board, but a few things that I wanted to focus on this morning. I think it's important to have a general sense of how the process works. So we have 90 days to make a decision, and in those 90 days, the 90 days start as soon as the user has generated his or her appeal, their appeal, and also, or as soon as Facebook has referred a case to us. There's also a possibility for expedited review. We haven't used that possibility yet. Expedited review, which allows to make a decision in shorter time, which is 30 days or 7 days. What is also interesting to mention is that the board is able to make recommendations. And for the discussion of today, which is related to AI and content moderation and transparency, that particular possibility is extremely important. Those recommendations are non-binding, it is true, but Facebook has, as per our bylaws, Facebook has to respond to those recommendations in 30 days. That's what the company did last week, a month after our Donald Trump decision. Facebook responded to many of the recommendations, I mean, to all of them actually, all of the recommendations that we had made in the previous decision. And they also announced how they were going to apply the binding part of the decision, which was related to the account reinstatement or deletion. I was saying that these recommendations are important for the discussion that we're having today because, as I said, Facebook has to respond to them, which is an important aspect when it comes to transparency. Recently, many of you are probably aware that Facebook announced its Transparency Center. I like to think that this is a direct consequence of this of the work of the board and of the open conversations that we've been having with Facebook on, well, the recommendations we make and how Facebook will implement them, or why the company cannot implement them. And we have made several recommendations on related to algorithms, related to how automated algorithms and moderation works. I remember particularly a case that happened in Brazil, where a public awareness campaign was published on Facebook, or on Instagram rather, showing nude female breast. Those images are normally banned on Facebook. You're not allowed to post a female breast on the platforms, on Facebook or Instagram, unless, of course, it's for educational purposes. And in this case, particularly, it was for a campaign against breast awareness. Oh, sorry, breast cancer. It's 6 a.m. That's why I knew I shouldn't speak at that time. Anyway, what was interesting in that case is that this was obviously an error on the part of the company. So when the board received the appeal on this case, the board chose to let Facebook know that we're taking the case and that there may be an error, an enforcement error, which Facebook recognized and reinstated immediately the content. But the board decided to go ahead anyway, because we thought it was important for us to, first of all, flag that errors like this are not acceptable, and also point to the limitations of automated content moderation. First of all, the user are not aware when their content has been flagged automatically by algorithms on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also made recommendations with regards to reincluding moderators, human moderators in the process. Because in that particular case, the campaign was quite important, quite viral, but the takedown obviously put those efforts to the ground, reduced them to no effect, unfortunately. So this is one aspect that I wanted to talk about this morning, explaining how we are using, although our mandate does not mention specifically that the board is allowed to, make decisions on algorithms and artificial intelligence. I just wanted to say that with the open conversations that recommendations allow us to have with the company, it's a very interesting tool for transparency, and yes, to open up more conversations on these issues in general. There is another aspect that I wanted to stress on rapidly before my time is up. Sorry, I've already done the life cycle. It's another feature, which is public comments. So each case opens up with a period of 14 days during which stakeholders, whether they are users or organizations or civil society organizations or even international organizations, can make comments on the particular case. And we have seen at several occasions that those comments well, first of all, in general, those comments are extremely helpful. So we usually encourage as many stakeholders as possible to submit such comments to the board. They're very helpful because they help us look at aspects of cases that maybe as board members we wouldn't have seen. And I'm thinking particularly here about still on that conversation around AI and moderation and transparency. We, in the Donald Trump case, we received recommendations through public comments, recommendations to encourage Facebook as a company to conduct an assessment of how its platform and algorithmic decisions might have contributed to events that happened in the United States on January the 6th, 2021. And well, this comment was extremely helpful for the board. We included this comment, or this recommendation rather, in our set of recommendations presented to the company. Of course, Facebook responded, and I think they said it would be difficult to implement this recommendation. We're still, digesting the whole lot of Facebook's response, but just to say that this is another avenue for our stakeholders to, make sure that the board is aware of certain issues, and yes, they can also end up being recommendations presented to the company. So I will stop here. I think my time is up. Happy to continue the conversation.
Julie, I wonder whether you could follow up on Nicole's question, which maybe you weren't here for, having to do with language. It seems to me that there are these categorical issues that follow the formulaic, we do recommendations, et cetera, and then there are these larger cross-cutting questions like language. And so, Nicole, do you want to put your question to Julie?
Sure. I'll just to follow on with what Monroe was saying, was the last two sessions we've had of this seminar series. One had colleagues from Ethiopia and Somalia from the Horn of Africa. And last week we had colleagues from the Sahel region. And I think one of the recurring issues that kept coming up was the issue of languages. And there's some pretty basic questions like, why aren't community standards yet translated into Somali? And I guess that's like a plumbing problem that we really are struggling to understand. No one seems to have an answer to it. Why aren't they in Somali? Why aren't they in Amharic? Why can't you report hateful content in these languages? And it doesn't seem like it's that complicated of an issue unless we're not understanding something. So this is an issue that we were discussing over the past couple of weeks. And the other issue is the difficulty algorithms have in addressing many African languages and what is being done about it and how people are thinking about it. So I think last week, again, when we were talking about the Sahel region, and I know you're from Francophone Africa, our colleagues from Burkina Faso and Mali were saying, well, actually the algorithms are now acting or addressing hateful language in French, but we don't see anything when it comes to other languages. And I think it's generally people's feeling that when it comes to many African languages, content just simply isn't being moderated, or it's being moderated at a minimal amount. And so I don't know if you can reflect on this issue and what your views are on it, and how it's being addressed. That would be really helpful.
Nicole, do you have any idea of the significance of this issue? That is to say, is there a lot of hate speech which is being missed through algorithms, or is it how is it both a substantive question and is it a question of great consequence?
Are you asking me or Julie?
I'm asking you as a way of refining your question to Julie.
Sure, as a way of refining the question, sure. And again, I'll refer back to our seminar. I think our colleagues from Somalia were very clear about the significance of hate speech online during the conflict in Somalia. So I think many people, and again, I think during the war, the conflict in Ethiopia, many Ethiopian colleagues are very concerned about what is being done, as well as the politicization of moderation. So the use of, systematic propaganda by governments and other groups, as well as the organized process of flagging hate speech, as well as different actors in terms of organizing groups to flag and identify what they see as hate speech, which might not necessarily be hate speech. It might just be opposition speech or critical speech.
Yes, no, these are extremely central issues at the moment. You will probably remember that civil society organizations have written letters to companies, and particularly Facebook, in the case of Ethiopia, to urge the company to better moderate, or simply to moderate, hate speech in the frame of the Tigray region potential genocide, or at least civil conflict. To your first remark, which was related to why aren't the community standards translated, and why aren't there, isn't there a better understanding of Somalia and all these other countries? So two aspects to that question. The first one, from the part of the company. I'm not going to speak for Facebook, but I will rely here on a public revelation that was published in The Guardian, I think, by a former Facebook employee who worked on a team tasked with looking at coordinated inauthentic behavior by governments. And that employee was saying that she expressed her frustration that when she was trying to flag inauthentic behavior in countries like Azerbaijan, for instance, or there were other countries in Latin America that are less interesting from a market perspective for Facebook because they make less ad money there, or there are less users than elsewhere. Well, the reaction from her her leadership was, they simply overlooked those markets. And I think these decisions are extremely unfortunate because our analysis at my organization, Internet Sans Frontières, we are a digital rights advocacy organization, which has been working on the link between moderation and freedom of expression and censorship by government, because that's another aspect which I will talk about a bit later. So what we've seen is that to better understand emerging practices used by bad actors to sow hatred or to sow disinformation in societies, well, we have to look precisely at those countries which are not interesting from a market perspective, but which are extremely interesting to test products, to test features, to look at loopholes, basically, exploit them, exploit the vulnerabilities of the system. So that's why, speaking as leader of Untitled Sans Frontières here, that's why we have always been telling companies, you should not overlooking those markets. These are markets where you should invest, not necessarily that much, but at least just paying attention. And we have seen, we have on this very issue of content moderation and civil conflict and reignition of past ethnic wounds, I would call them, especially on a continent like Africa. We our organization, Untitled Sans Frontières, was the first one to take big companies such as Facebook, Google at the time. We also reached out to Twitter, which was not interested at the time in 2018. We told them, well, the problem when you do not moderate is that it's directly linked to the increase and surge of internet shutdowns that we're seeing in the world. So internet shutdowns is a phenomenon in which a government voluntarily decides to cut itself out from internet. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the justification was we need to preserve public security. But increasingly, the justification is Facebook and Twitter are not moderating content. This is creating hate speech. This is letting hate speech flow freely in the country. So to protect public safety, we need to cut out access to these platforms. So for us, this was an argument to to convince platforms that they should not overlook these countries, because if they overlook them, these are exactly the countries that are going to shut down access to social media. It is true that this justification is completely weaponized, governments are using that to gain sympathy from the public opinion, and it's working. And it's becoming more difficult to explain to individuals that we should not cut out Facebook in the name of fight against hate speech or in the name of fighting disinformation. It's becoming extremely difficult to do that. An example is in the Republic of Guinea in West Africa, where, of course, the authorities weaponized platforms and used inauthentic behavior to manipulate ahead of the presidential elections. That is a reality. But on the other hand, there were also extremely heated discourses that normally wouldn't have their place on a platform such as Facebook if that was happening in the US or if it was happening in Europe. So, so in this mix of, conflicting situations, the public opinion was, well, what should we do? We have a problem with content. We don't want our country to become a country where people are killing each other over discourses on social media. So the only solution is, yes, we agree with the government, we should shut down. So yes, this is an extremely important question. And that's why I was insisting on transparency. That's why, for instance, the board has asked Facebook to explain how it creates its hate speech policy, and particularly its hate speech policy with regards to slurs. As you may be aware, there are certain slurs that you're not allowed to say in English or in French. I mean, there are a list of words in several languages that you're not allowed to say on the platform. It's interesting because while these lists can be helpful, they can also be, misinterpreted. So there is absolutely a lack of context. But at least having the information, shedding more light on how this slurs work. How do you come up with those lists? Is an extremely important first step towards transparency in how, moderation is being done, and particularly automated moderation is being done. That's the first thing. The second thing, and that's not directly related to the work of the board, but rather related to my work as a director of Internet Sans Frontières, Internet Without Borders, is that we are convinced that it's possible to add context to machine learning. But to do that, you need to work with local organizations. You need to tap into their knowledge of the local context, their knowledge of the language. And if, for instance, Facebook wants to build up a list of slurs in, I don't know, Amharic or Kiswahili or any other language that is not the dominant ones, which are English, French, etc. Well, if Facebook wants to build such a list, for instance, why not work with civil society organizations in those countries that know very well these languages, the context around these words, particularly the time when those conversations are becoming heated. Is it during an election? Is it during a demonstration? Well, there are lots of information that we can add into the machine learning systems. And that's what exactly Untitled Chapter is currently working on, based on a study that we did in 5 countries in West and Central Africa. So this was a long response, but I thought it was important for the sake of this conversation.
Nicole, is Sarah present?
No, unfortunately, she's missing. So we've been trying to track her down. But I think we can definitely open it up to other questions, because I've seen some colleagues or some of the participants have questions. And so I would just say, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we will allow you to speak. So that's also fine. I don't know if Augustina, if you also wanted to, Martin, yeah.
I just wanted to step in and I wanted to thank Julie for getting up that early. I'm from Berlin, 4 p.m. time zone, much more agreeable. I would have a question, because you told us about this second track where Facebook can bring issues to the board, and I would be interested in what kind of cases are those they're bringing to the board from themselves. Is there a pattern behind them? Because that could be a good indicator of what is important for them, what's their frame of reference when dealing with such cases.
So far, we have received a lot of cases, referral cases from Facebook, but we have agreed to work on, I think, two. One, which was related to COVID-19 misinformation. So Facebook had a lot of problems dealing with, particularly with cures that were advertised on, not advertised, but talked about on the platform. In that particular case, it involved a group which supports a particular doctor in France who has been advocating for a particular cure, very famous cure against COVID-19. And Facebook didn't know basically how to, well, deal with discourse that hasn't been directly linked to harm, but that is nevertheless questionable in a time of pandemic, at least from the perspective of the platform. In that case, I remember that the board responded that, well, Facebook was not right to take down, I think they had taken down the content, and they were referring the case to know if they had done the right thing. So we told Facebook that they were not right to take down the content for various reasons. First of all, the lack of clarity of its community standards or policies in general with regards to COVID-19 and disinformation and misinformation, sorry. Lack of clarity because the policies were scattered all around Facebook. You didn't, to know the COVID-19 policy, it was very, very difficult. You had to look at different standards, and some of them were even contradicting themselves. So it was very complicated to understand. That's the first thing. And the second thing that the board assessed was that the risk of harm had not been clearly explained by the company. I mean, had not been clearly made obvious by the company. So for those reasons, the board asked the company to reinstate the account. Oh, sorry, the publication. What I did not mention, and which is extremely important, and thank you for giving me the occasion to add that, is the board makes its decision based on Facebook community standards, which are the rules that the company has adopted for everyone to respect on its platforms. But also we make our decision based on international law. And that is where the issues around clarity, legality, proportionality, all these debates that, all this balance that you need to strike before censoring or before limiting freedom of expression. Well, these are elements that we assess when we look at cases. So, yeah.
Well, I was fascinated by this question on language, going back to language, that the incentives for Facebook weren't appropriate because they were market oriented and they clashed with the language issue itself. So the importance of hate speech in one zone as opposed to another seems inappropriately governed. And in a way, the FOB is designed to be independent to remedy the incentives that are available only within Facebook. So is there a development of an extension of the FOB into these other areas where the internal incentives are screwed up in some way?
So we haven't expanded our mandate, or we haven't modified the bylaws for that, for that particular purpose. But what I can say is that in many of our decisions, first of all, we are aware of the challenges that the companies may face especially in countries where they receive direct pressures from authorities, for instance, not to look at things or to look at things. So we do point to these realities in some of our decisions. I remember particularly a recent decision involving a case from India, in which the board asked Facebook during its deliberations. We asked Facebook questions on whether or not they're receiving pressures with regards to content in India, and how they're facing those difficulties, those challenges. And we also asked about the work of the moderators. Are they equipped with sufficient information to be able to do their work without suppressing freedom of expression, basically? And well, the company was candid enough to offer some information, which not all of them are public, but it was. I'm mentioning this just to say that the board is aware of these difficulties, and the board seizes opportunities to not only ask questions, but also recommend the company not to look only at the market incentives, but to really look at the urgent necessity to protect human rights, and particularly protect freedom of expression. I think we did such recommendation in the latest decision that we published, or not the latest, but the previous month we published the decision on the Donald Trump case. We did expressly tell Facebook to, put in resources necessary to protect freedom of expression, and also, yes, do so in a way that that's not only related to market incentives, preoccupations.
Thank you. Giovanni, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really interesting to hear from you. And as you have seen, the topic of language, has raised different points, and in a way has also shows in a way what are also sometimes the inequalities sometimes when we deal with content moderation in different areas of the world. And this also reminds us, that even if we deal with a global community and we have that kind of, also narratives in terms of how we want to protect free speech on a global scale, then sometimes we forget that there is so much diversity that needs to be moderated in a way, and so this is a big challenge wherever we are in the world, even in Europe or in the US, because we should not forget that even in Europe, for example, there are so many languages, even just in the European Union. So it's even not so easy to moderate content, just for example, in countries, especially in Eastern Europe, where there are very small languages, and it's very, very challenging. Especially, for example, for the challenges of hate speech in some European countries, that is another challenge also for the rule of law. So there is challenges everywhere about that. This is very important to stress. But what I would like also to hear a little bit from you is also because today we also are supposed to talk about kind of corporate social responsibility that leads us to talk about the incentives that social media have to moderate content in certain areas. Because of course, we have discussed a lot of times that the framework of business and human rights could be an incentive also for social media to behave, in a certain way, also to respect human rights. But we know at the same time that this has not mandatory requirements, and also human rights law does not apply to private actors. So the question, and I would like to hear more, is about the incentives, to do more in these areas, especially the case in Myanmar or in other regions, like also in Ethiopia, what's happening in the north of the country, is showing something that goes beyond, legal requirements. And I would like to hear more from you. What do you think about the future of corporate social responsibility and the incentives to moderate content, whether maybe even social media are even more powerful than even small states, especially, or even fragile states? So this is a question for all of you. Whoever want to answer, I'm very pleased to hear your comments, your ideas, and your feedback. Thanks.
I'm happy to go ahead. Thank you, Giovanni. CSR for social media companies in the future, I think it's going to be central. You are all aware of the Twitter ban in Nigeria, in which the Nigerian government has decided to ban access to Twitter to its users after, in retaliation of after Twitter deleted a publication by the president, not the former, the incumbent president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari. So that case is interesting and shows the extent to which content moderation is going to be, is being politicized, definitely. But I think it is being politicized precisely, in my opinion, not speaking for the board here, but speaking as a leader of an organization that has been looking at these trends very closely. I think this politicization has been possible partly because of a lack of transparency or insufficient transparency from the part of the company on content moderation, and particularly how it comes up with the decisions that are extremely impactful for free speech and for perception of free speech. So why am I saying this? Although I personally think that, public leaders should be more responsible with regards to what they say on social media platforms because of the impact it can have and because of the audience that they have. While I'm convinced that in this case, Twitter particularly made a choice that was necessary, in my opinion, again, not speaking for any institution here. At the same time, I think there was room for explanation to be given by the company. And that lack of explanation has led to a country like Nigeria being on the defensive and exploiting the first opportunity it had to do what it wasn't able to do, what it hasn't been able to do since, I think, 2019, that the Nigerian government has been trying to control speech on social media platforms in the name of fighting hate speech and fake news. Particularly, the government almost passed a legislation that would have forced companies to take down content. I'm saying that the authorities seized this opportunity because, of course, they wanted to regain control on the narrative after the EndSARS demonstrations that happened a few months ago, still in Nigeria, in which people were demonstrating against police brutality, and it gained momentum. It was trending on Twitter. Even Jack Dorsey tweeted about it, raised money in cryptocurrencies to support the movement. So just all this to say that in this environment, it's very surprising that social media companies have not understood yet, or seem not to have understood yet, that their content moderation is going to be politicized, especially in countries that have no regulation so far on the digital in general and on moderation particularly, that have no regulation, on privacy, which is also extremely important. We don't talk about it because we are focused on freedom of expression, but I think those two rights and issues are extremely linked. So it's very unfortunate that the companies haven't understood that. And even more so because those countries are exactly the countries where, from a market perspective, they are interesting for everyone else. I mean, not only companies from the US, not only the major social media platforms, but others. In the case of Nigeria, it's been said, I'm not aware, we do not have data on that, but I've been reading the press, and some investigations tend to suggest that the authorities have been in close contact with Chinese regulators to talk about a potential firewall. What does a firewall mean? In China, a firewall means that Twitter is not available, but they have Weibo. Weibo is extremely more control, or at least it's easier to control discussions on Weibo. This is what is at stake here. And that's why I think corporate social responsibility is even more important in content moderation, because that content moderation is being extremely politicized at the moment. And if we're not conscious of that or not doing anything against that, we risk a real splinter net. I mean, this is pending. Nigeria is just the first example. It's the biggest African country with the most Twitter users on the continent and among the most tweeting nations of the world. So this is a signal that right now we should all sit down at the table. I am in favor of a multi-stakeholder dialogue that involves not only governments and Twitter in a closed door discussing what they can take down and what they can leave up, but a discussion that includes organizations like Untitled Chapter, but like many others who are aware of the tensions between public safety, the importance of protecting public safety against hate speech, against disinformation on social media platforms, but also government censorship, which is very real, government manipulation, which is extremely real, and corporate social responsibility in all of that, on top of respecting international human rights law. So that's the call that we are making at Untitled Sans Frontières with other organizations, and hopefully this is something that's going to happen soon.
I don't know if Agustina want to add something on that.
Sure, I was just going to ask if I think Augustina was about to speak. Did you want to come in, Augustina?
I was listening to Julie. It's always fascinating to hear from inside the board and how you guys are thinking about these issues. I'm a cautious optimistic about the role of the board, and I really hope the experiment is successful. I think we were really stuck in the content moderation conversation, and the board comes as a new attempt, at least, to unstuck that conversation and get it moving forward. I think there's a number of things that I can say about corporate social responsibility in relation to hate speech particularly, but also to other kinds of contents. I feel this conversation is always too broad to capture the nuances. There's a huge difference between illegal content and content moderation, and that huge difference, we cannot let that different kinds of contents be put into the same basket. And I feel there's a risk that in putting those two kinds of contents, which in my mind are very different, in the same basket, we start renegotiating the limits and restrictions to legitimate speech. Particularly on hate speech, I think there's a number of different ways in which different countries and different international instruments approach the issue. I think the US is in a very different position from the rest of the world in this respect. And most of the companies we're talking about are based in the US, where the US doesn't recognize any positive obligations on the state to promote the exercise or guarantee the conditions for the exercise of freedom of expression, as opposed to a lot of other countries that do establish a positive obligation on the state to align their entire legal structures and administrative structures and to facilitate the exercise of freedom of expression. And I think that sort of cascades to these conversations. So a lot of the issues that in the States are viewed under corporate social responsibility, in Europe will probably not be viewed under corporate social responsibility, but under state duties, under the European Convention on Human Rights. and in the Americas under the Inter-American Convention on human rights. So I think there's a broader conversation there beyond what the companies do or don't do. I think there's an ecosystem kind of conversation that needs to take place to really address these nuances. What do we want to deal with under what should we be dealing with under content moderation? What should we be dealing with under legal versus illegal content? And be very clear, because I think that's where the politicization that Julie was talking about comes along. We see worldwide a number of different efforts from different states to basically outlaw speech on platforms that they cannot outlaw in their congresses because it's against their own legislation. So I think there's a tension there that requires a lot more attention. I think it's something that we all do, and I do myself a lot. We focus on content moderation without distinguishing illegal versus legal. And I think that's a very important distinction that we should be emphasizing a lot more often, and maybe even creating different conversations or different branches of conversations for those as well. So I'll leave it there. I have a number of different comments that I could make, but
No, I was going to say, thank you so much for that, Agustina. I think this is something that we've also been discussing at other seminars as part of this series, because one of the big challenges is the definitions of hate speech. And for instance, we were talking about this in our Horn of Africa seminar, where there's very, very different definitions among, for instance, the Afar community, the Somali community in Ethiopia, the Tigrayan community. And it's not just a matter of translating community standards into different languages. It's about negotiating these very different ideas of what hate speech or dangerous speech might be, and also looking, for instance, at the role of customary law. So how Somali customary law gets freedom of expression or for hate speech. And I think that's one of the really big challenges, particularly when you see that a lot of the speech is coming from the diaspora communities. So it's not simply, I think there's been sort of a tendency to say, oh, we should be organizing, workshops and groups with different communities and civil society groups within different countries that are, so-called marginalized, or where these discussions haven't been happening as much. But then in the case of Ethiopia, when you see a lot of the hate coming from some Ethiopians in Norway, how do you handle these kinds of civil society supposed national dialogues when it's really a transnational dialogue? I think if I can, we do have from Anjali. I'm just going to allow her to speak. Anjali, go ahead, please. You should be able to talk. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Hi, everyone. I don't know why my camera is still off, but I'll just leave it off. It's probably for the best since it's nearly midnight, or it's past midnight here in Melbourne. I am a postdoctoral fellow at Melbourne Law School, and my research relates primarily to vilifying speech or hate speech directed at women. I had a question for Julie regarding the Facebook Oversight Board, and specifically that decision that you mentioned, Julie, on the breast cancer awareness campaign. So based on my work, images of naked female body parts, including breasts, don't constitute hate speech, shouldn't constitute offensive speech, is somewhat misogynistic to regulate or to censor. But we know from the testimonies of women who use platforms like Facebook, so including Facebook, but not exclusively Facebook, that a lot of really virulent content that would constitute hate speech or vilifying speech directed at women often goes completely unregulated and unmoderated. And I was wondering what the Oversight Board sees its role as in relation to, I guess, framing, influencing, providing recommendations in relation to the content moderation policies themselves, rather than just their interpretation and application. Do you see a role in that regard, or is it specifically a quasi-judicial and administrative function that you see yourself performing in terms of interpreting and applying existing policies?
Thank you very much for asking, Anjali, and thank you for staying with us so late in Melbourne. Your question actually allows me to talk about another aspect of our work, which is making policy advisory, how do we call it? Basically, Facebook can ask us advice on policy change that they want to make on one of their community standards. And we haven't done so yet, but it's a feature that exists, if you allow me to speak that way, and that allows the board to specifically give guidance to Facebook on how or in what direction a policy change should happen with regards to a particular community standard. So we will certainly do that in the future. I'm sure of it. It's been only a year, so we've been, and it's been only 6 months that we've started taking cases. But this is a feature that exists, and I'm sure that I will see very soon some very particular community standard change after a recommendation by the Oversight Board.
Thanks, Julie. Can I just jump in and ask one tiny question to follow up on that? Do you anticipate in providing those recommendations or that guidance that you'll be relying on experts to advise on, say, definitions of harmful speech? Yeah, absolutely.
We will rely on not only experts to do research on a particular subject, but also we will, speaking with caution here because I don't have dates or anything, but I'm just saying that in principle, there are also engagement opportunities in the frame of this policy change, requests from Facebook. So yes, there will be engagement, and I'm also happy to keep in touch if you'd like to talk more about the work you do, because I'm sure we'll have a lot of requests from Facebook on that particular policy around female breast cancer or female nudity in general on the platform.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, that would be amazing. Really happy to stay in touch and contribute in whatever way might be useful. Thank you.
I'm texting you my email right now.
Perfect, thanks. Lovely.
I think that's a very interesting question, also in terms of what information and data the board is going to be releasing. So you spoke about Facebook's Transparency Center. I think when it comes to looking at transparency about what's happening in many African countries, like takedown of content, other things, it's just a blank. So you put in Ethiopia, you put in, Central African Republic, and nothing comes back. I think we struggle to understand, again, is this a plumbing problem, or is it because nothing is happening there? I mean, is the board going to be releasing all of the cases? What data will the board release in terms of who's putting forward these cases, who's referring the cases, what cases were referred, what kind of data? Will your strategy, I guess, on transparency and release of data somehow be different from Facebook? Will you be offering more information, or can you tell us a little bit about that?
So we are still working on our first transparency report, which is due at the end of this year. But yes, it's going to be a different strategy than Facebook, because obviously the public might not be the same. We are still, discussing that. In terms of what you should expect, first, a breakdown of the regions where most cases that we've made a decision on originated from. Also the number of appeals we have received so far. That information, by the way, is already public. As of, I think, January or February, we had received something like 200K appeals. That's a lot. And that's also why we will be we will extend membership to 40 members to make sure we can, take as many cases as possible in a year. So that's the first thing. The other elements that could be, I'm not talking, in a very affirmative way, because this is really an ongoing discussion, but there should be also information on, sorry, I'm looking at message at the same time. We'll certainly have information on, well, probably some of the questions that we asked to Facebook. We've started doing that in the Donald Trump case, in which we stated that we had asked, I think, close to 40 questions, and that Facebook refused to answer to some of them, and we explained which ones Facebook refused to answer to. Yes, these are just a few elements. It's not the comprehensive transparency endeavor that I'm detailing there, but it's an ongoing discussion, and there will be much more out very soon.
I'd like to ask a question about.
Yeah, I just wanted to add
other...
something. I'm sorry.
Oh, so with respect to community standards, it's interesting to see the dynamic between the board and the company. But what about international law? International law gets little attention so far in this discussion because it's assumed to be fixed and in a box. And there's really no reason to talk to the company about it because it's out there. So my question will be, are there alternative aspects of international law of freedom of expression that are under discussion? And how does the board see itself with respect to that as a dynamic as opposed to a fixed set of rules?
Oh, wow, that's a very tough but necessary question there. Thank you so much for asking. So one thing is sure is that the board is tiptoeing on a very uncharted territory, which is it possible to apply principles of freedom of expression, internationally proclaimed principles? Is it possible to apply them to social media platforms and to global platforms? Because that's the characteristic that calls for an international approach. Because we're talking about spaces where there are potentially no border, or at least theoretically no borders. So that's the first thing. How we are approaching this? Well, we are conscious of, first of all, the limitations. It is true that international law, the primary responsibles for applying international law and enforcing it are governments. That we do not disagree with that. We always remind this in our decisions. But what we think is encouraging is that Facebook voluntarily agreed to respect human rights, voluntarily put itself into the framework of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, which say that in the conduct of their business, I'm just summarizing here, not quoting, but the conduct of their business, companies should refrain from, contributing to violations of international human rights of their consumers, users, however you want to call them. So in that regard, we always remind in our decisions that Facebook does not have to apply international human rights law, but rather voluntarily accepted to put itself limit in order to prevent its business to contribute to human rights violations. And in that respect, I think it opens up avenue for, reconciliation of, on the one hand, interpretation of international human rights law as it exists. We frequently refer to, I forget, the name is missing right now, but we frequently refer to the work of UN Special Rapporteurs on freedom of expression who have addressed issues around content moderation, human rights, freedom of expression, but also we refer to interpretations that have been made of this international text. General Comment 34, for instance, is a very interesting document for us. But at the same time, we also realize that we are in a space where a lot is still to be built and a lot has yet to be said. So I don't have in mind any particular, very groundbreaking declaration we have made so far, because we haven't yet. We've relied a lot on General Comment 34 and others. But just to say that the board is really conscious of the fact that it's evolving in a place where no one has ever been before, and we're trying things. Agustina, sorry, was rightly speaking of an experiment. And well, in an experiment, you try, you might fail, but if it succeeds, it's also great. And if it succeeds, you reiterate and reiterate until it becomes, a system, a perfected system. So I guess that's where we are right now.
It's very exciting. Martin, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just had a follow-up question to the previous one, and that is when you were talking about transparency, then my little bit selfish question is what role does data access and transparency towards science and research play a role there? Because I'm doing a lot of content analysis work in different projects, and this always is a problem to have no access to, particularly when talking about hate speech, particularly to deleted messages. We're lobbying for that on different levels, like the Social Science One initiative, or on national or EU legislation level, to push platforms to give science better access to data, to make it possible for us to study and better understand what's going on there in these public platform discourses.
I can't speak for the board on this particular question, because we haven't had the opportunity yet to have a public position on that. But as an activist who is a member of the board, this is extremely important for us too, especially for countries where a lot is happening, but not a lot is being known. So yeah, we haven't had the opportunity, but of course, if we do, and in the past we have proved that, we will not hesitate to ask questions at the very least, or make a recommendation in another case scenario. So thank you for asking that. It's in the discussion. I mean, it's part of discussion. We haven't had the opportunity yet, but we are, of course, the board is very aware of all discussion surrounding content, access to data and information.
Well, are there other questions from this observers or other participants? I'll just conclude with one question, which is, I'm kind of interested in what I'm calling an epistemic community. I'm not even sure what that means, but it's the idea of a kind of community of thought that surrounds a decision-making body, and how that's evolving with respect to the FOB. Is it a rich and interesting epistemic community? Is it too narrow? How does this develop over time? And in a view, the kind of a necessity. Nicole, everybody here is a part of this epistemic community in some way, fascinated and interested in how the FOB develops, and these kind of odd interactions of the kind that we're having today, which is great. So I don't know if you have any observations on the development of this idea of an epistemic community. Sometimes you call it stakeholders, but I'm not sure if that's the right So,
If I can follow up on Monroe's questions, I'd say that the interesting flip of that is what do you see as the gaps? You know, as I listen to you talking, I hear a lot of freedom of expression, and I'm also wondering, what about responsibility to protect? What about, you know, there's a lot of international human rights law, but I think as we're getting back to these sort of very difficult questions about defining hate speech, what about Sharia law? What about different forms of regulating speech?
or propaganda.
How do you see this? Exactly. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
As part of your community, as Monroe was talking about, or where do you see these gaps?
Well, first, we do look at other human rights. As you will see in our decisions, in every case, we explain which human rights are at stake. And usually it's not only freedom of expression, although freedom of expression is ultimately the one we have to, I mean, we were created to help Facebook protect, but we definitely take into account other human rights, including the right to, although it's discussed whether or not it's a human right, but at least the right to safety and many other issues. Privacy also is something that we are interested in. So we on you know, what you were saying when we're on this epistemic community, I think this is a really interesting moment, again, in which we are basically all together, the board, with the help of other stakeholders, either they be organizations, but also individuals who lodge those appeals to our board. Well, we are all together contributing and participating in this extremely interesting exercise of rewriting, enhancing the community standards of Facebook so that they are, first of all, more clear, more transparent, more easily understandable by users in general, and so in a way to make them more respectful of our right to speak. So yes, I think that's the direction maybe this is taking, hopefully. In the case of Donald Trump, sorry, again, I'm referring to that case because it was particular. I mean, there was a lot of innovation in there. First of all, we were not supposed to take account suspensions, but now we do, which is great. But we also received almost 10K comments, public comments, which were extremely helpful for the drafting of the decision. So yeah, just to say that this exercise is extremely interesting, and yes, we'll see, hopefully will help us come up with greater community standards and help Facebook come up with greater community standards.
So Agustina, do you want to say a final word, or because if not, I know that what?
I can say one final word. I don't think there's any problems in focusing on freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is part of a framework of international human rights law, and it should be read in conjunction and as part of the conventions where the protections specific to freedom of expression are. When we interpret the limits, the restrictions to freedom of expression, we find the wide richness and variety of the other rights that the convention calls to protect and to guarantee. I do feel on the internet, at least, any regulation, self-regulation, any tweaking has such radical potential to affect particularly freedom of expression and privacy, if I may say. That doesn't necessarily happen with all the other rights. So I think the focus should be within this right, read as part of a wider instrument and as part of a wider legal system, which is provided by international human rights law. As to the epistemic community, I hope it's evolving. And I like the term a lot better than multi-stakeholderism, if I may say. So I'm on your team to rename this thing an epistemic community.
Excellent. Well, with that as a final note, I want to thank you, and I also want to thank Julie, especially for getting up so early on the Pacific coast. And it's been a great event, and thank you very much. And we'll see you next year. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.